Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and last week I told you I got invited to the White House for a creator economy conference, and I am now back from that trip, and I thought I would fill you in on what took place. Let's get to it. Now this video is being brought to you by all of you. That includes people who watch my content on a regular basis, but also those of you who contribute to the channel on an ongoing basis, either through my donor box page at Lon.TV/support, or through YouTube's membership program, Patreon, and Floatplane. I greatly appreciate everyone's support of the channel, and it really helped get me over to DC to give those folks in Washington a piece of my mind. It was only a one-day conference. It was on Wednesday of last week, and it started the night before, actually, with a pretty cool party that the folks from TubeFilter held at a rooftop bar. It was a lot of fun meeting some new folks that I hadn't met before, including people who create content, but also people who support the creator economy. And you can learn more about TubeFilter at their website at tubefilter.com. They cover all the happenings in independent content creation, and this was the view we had from that rooftop location. It was pretty cool. And then, of course, the conference kicked off the next day. It went from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., and it was held on the grounds of the White House, but not in the White House proper. So we were in the old executive office building, which is next door to the White House. Now, the event was held in the Indian Treaty Room. Of note, this room is where President Eisenhower held the first televised press conference by a U.S. president, and it's been used for events like this over the years. There seems to be no consensus as to why it is called the Indian Treaty Room, although many folks suspect that it was called that because that's where the U.S. government used to store treaties with Native American tribes, but nobody knows that for certain. And I guess at one point it was used by the Navy back in the day. Now, as far as the agenda is concerned, you can see what it looks like here. And we kicked the day off with a discussion about mental health. And each of these panel discussions, unfortunately, did not allow us to ask questions. However, I was pleased that the questions that were asked were the questions that I had in mind. So at least in those sessions, they thought a lot about what questions to ask of the people on these panels. Now, the first panel consisted of a few creators along with Neera Tanden, who is the domestic policy advisor for the White House. And this one actually was more interesting than I anticipated. And one of the things that came up, and it became a theme throughout the day, is how these algorithms are really driving a lot of the problems and challenges that we keep bringing up. So in the case of creator mental health, algorithms often will steer viewers towards whatever the drama of the day is, especially if they have a habit of clicking on videos that are about dramas happening on various platforms. And that creates demand for more content. That content gets fed to more and more users. And if you're on the receiving end of that negative attention, it can sometimes impact mental health significantly. Of course, we've seen a lot of creators step back from creating content on platforms due to that. So that was one of the topics that came up. Another thing that was discussed was the fact that people are able to make these videos or comments sometimes anonymously, but that is, of course, protected by the First Amendment here in the United States. Anonymous speech is just as important as speech that you make with your identity. Another topic that came up was AI, of course, and there we had Dr. Arati Prabhakar, who is the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and that was a wide-ranging discussion. Algorithms once again came up because they used to call it machine learning, but now these AIs are directing us to whatever we see on these platforms, and often we're seeing things that we already agree with as opposed to having our views challenged, right? But another thing that she brought up were copyright issues that are springing up related to artificial intelligence. In fact, a lot of folks who wanted to go to the event and were not invited were artists who are seeing their work going into these AI models and then being used to make these generative AI pieces of artwork. And the concern there, of course, is that their work is being repurposed and essentially sold without compensation going back to those artists. That was something she said is going to have to get worked out in courts, but unfortunately a lot of small creators, most of them actually, don't have the money to go take on Google or some other big corporation to test the law in this area. And she also brought up the fact that what is it that these things are actually training on? Is it the artwork itself, or is it some kind of numerical pattern that's developed from the words or images that these things are being trained on? So this is a very new large new frontier, if you will, and there didn't seem to be a lot of consensus about how we deal with this short of taking people to court. But this is where perhaps there might need to be some legislation to come up with some ground rules for this. So that was where things were kind of left there. I found this chat to be one of the more interesting ones of the day, which is about fair pay. I talked a little bit about this on the video that I did last week. Wally Ademio, who's the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, was the one who took the questions from Hannah Williams on that. And one of the things that I hadn't thought about was how you get access to capital, both for your business, but also for getting a mortgage or something like that. When I bought my house, I was already employed, so I didn't have to worry about going to the bank and trying to prove that I actually have a job. But for many creators who are starting at a young age doing content creation and making a business and a career out of it, often don't have the things that people who are employed by a company have insofar as pay stubs and other things that can verify their income. And in the case of getting a business loan, many creators just have a phone and their likeness as their business. You don't have any inventory or assets or big buildings that you can use as collateral for getting lines of credit. And that was something that I found quite interesting because it is a problem facing creators and impedes their ability to grow. And it's something that also impacts small business owners across other industries too. And that was something that the Deputy Secretary said that they were focusing on. So that was something that I enjoyed listening to quite a bit. Then something interesting happened, well actually a little bit earlier in the day. Around noon on our agenda, we had a line here that said intermission and then remarks. And things started getting a little bit interesting around noon because they brought out a podium. This guy came out testing microphones, and then I got a text from a friend of mine who's the pool reporter for the day, and he works for NBC as a cameraman, and he says, "We're coming in hot." And I'm like, "Whoo, what's that mean?" And what do you know? Within about 5 minutes of that text, I saw him setting up in the back with a bunch of other members of the media. And then the president walks in. Now, the first thing President Biden did when he entered the room was take a selfie with us, and he realized he didn't get everybody into one shot, so he took 2 pictures, which was really nice. Unfortunately, though, they have not released those selfies to us or anyone else, so I don't have them to show you. But I did find myself in this picture that Lindsey Gamble, a fellow participant, had taken during the event. You can find him at lon.TV/LINDSEY. And you'll see me there off to the side because I was networking before the event began, and that was the best spot I could get once everything got underway. But you can see just how small a group this was, which was really cool. What the president spoke about initially was about his grandchildren and how they are getting most of their information now from independent creators on various platforms. And he noted it was a pretty big shift from how he used to get information earlier in his life. And I think that was very impactful to hear a sitting president talk about just how much influence now independent media has in delivering messages to the public. Additionally, he talked about some of the frustrations he has in that people tend to go seek out the information that they already agree with. He made reference to cable networks, but it's not a far stretch, and I think he mentioned this a little bit later in his remarks, that there's also an issue of algorithms delivering content that they know you'll want to watch over long periods of time, and you're likely to tune out things that you might disagree with and not consider other points of view. Again, algorithms kind of coming up in the course of discussion here. And what he did is he gave us about 15 minutes of remarks, and then he kicked the press out of the room, the traditional media, and took some questions from the rest of us. So you can see the 15 minutes that he did initially on YouTube on the White House page. You can go to lon.TV/creatorconf to see the full length of that. But he gave us another 15 plus minutes, and he took a couple of questions. The first one he got was one that I thought was like a total waste of time, and I was hoping it would have been a little better, but it turned out to be the best question of the 2 that he took. Somebody asked him what his favorite social media platform is. And he didn't answer the question directly, but what he did do is start talking about his grandchildren again. And this time he went through each grandchild, some of them are young adults now, and talked about the things that they were interested in, the platforms that they consume most readily, and how they processed and thought about the information that was presented to them. He spends a lot of time with his grandchildren, and although I don't think he uses social media much himself, his grandchildren sure do, and he's very interested in how they consume it. And that was very clear from that answer that he sees this dichotomy in generations as to how one generation gets its information and processes it versus his generation, both in how they used to receive information and how they get it now. So that was a very interesting answer to a very simple question, I thought. Throughout the entire session, he was pretty relaxed. I think the weight of not running for office again is certainly off his shoulders now, so he can be not necessarily loose, but certainly a little less cautious about the events that he goes to and how much time he spends at them. I learned later that he was only supposed to be with us for about 5 or 10 minutes, but again, we got him for almost 40, which is unheard of to get a sitting president for that long. He only took 2 questions, though. He spent a lot of time answering those questions and telling some fun anecdotes of his career and some of the different things he's experienced in life, which obviously is his right to do. I was hoping to get a question in myself because back in 1996, Biden was one of the senators who supported the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. That bill set the stage for the entire creator economy, which was the subject of the conference that we were attending. Basically, what happened in 96 when that bill passed, it made it so that a copyright holder couldn't sue a website for what their users do. So for example, on YouTube, if you put a video up that's copyrighted and YouTube receives notification that it's a copyrighted work, they can take it down. But as long as they respond to that takedown request, they have safe harbor from litigation. Before that law, that was not the case. So without the DMCA, and it is imperfect, you would not have the platforms that you have today, and this $250 billion industry would not exist. So sometimes laws can actually help industries sprout and take hold and turn into something. And I was curious if he felt that we needed something similar now that we're into this AI era, where we have algorithms determining where and what we watch and consume and how we process information, and the generative AI issues that I brought up before. Do we need to do something now? Unfortunately, I could not get that question answered because I was probably too far away from him to get his attention. But again, he only took 2 questions and spent a good long time answering them. But all in, it was more than I expected to experience on this trip, having that much time with a sitting president. And agree with him or not, it's nice that the White House acknowledged that creators like me, people that sit in their basements like I do and make content, have a very important role to play in society. And I expect that that position is going to carry over to the next administration, no matter who is elected. And then after all of that, we had some breakout sessions where we had 90 minutes in smaller groups to discuss matters that were on our minds with White House staff, but also each other. And like the main group of 120, these smaller groups were very well represented across the industry. So it was clear that the organizers of the event at the White House were very careful to make sure that there was a good mix of voices in each of these sessions. Now, one group that was missing from the event at large, at least as far as I know, were the platforms themselves. So there wasn't anybody from Meta or YouTube or TikTok there. And I thought they would have been very helpful to have as a seat at the table because we could have addressed some of our concerns directly with them. And a big theme of my group had to do with the algorithms, and these go across the board. So for example, I brought up the matter of fair pay as it relates to the invalid traffic issue that I brought up a few months ago on this channel. In a nutshell, what's happening is that the YouTube algorithm can't determine sometimes that traffic to a YouTube channel is real. And so what they do is claw back your revenue. And somehow this is only impacting smaller channels, not the larger ones. Most recently, the Antenna Man got hit with it, but many others have as well. And you can check out the video that I did about that on my channel. But also, this impacts mental health, as I mentioned, and it also impacts matters that involve getting information out to people. And one thing I heard this president say in person was the fact that he was concerned people tend to get information from sources that agree with their point of view, as opposed to getting a few different perspectives of a particular issue. And that was what this president said to us. The prior president, President Trump, was also concerned about this. They said it in different ways, but at the end of the day, it's the same kind of problem here. So much so that President Trump put together an executive order which looks specifically at algorithms that they said were suppressing content or users based on indications of political alignment or viewpoint. And we talked a lot about what is already in law right now for broadcasters, like equal time for candidates, which is something that is still the law of the land to this day. We also talked about some older regulations like the Fairness Doctrine, which was removed in the late 80s. It was an FCC requirement for broadcasters to provide different perspectives of controversial issues. That was removed under First Amendment concerns. But in looking at the Trump executive order here, this was like one step away from reinstituting the Fairness Doctrine. So there's a lot of things that I think we should look at, not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but look at what's worked for other media in the past that might apply here. And of course, you got to be very, very careful with it. Surprisingly, the issue of the TikTok law that was passed just recently that requires them to divest themselves or leave the U.S. market completely only came up towards the end. And what was interesting in that discussion was the fact that TikTok is representing this as a ban. They will not be banned if they divest their Chinese ownership. And there's actually some precedent for requiring owners of media companies to be U.S. citizens. And this was brought up in the course of our discussion. I didn't even know about this because it happened when I was a kid. But when Rupert Murdoch was building up his media empire, he was required to become a U.S. citizen in order to buy up some local television stations due to rules that were in place about media ownership. And I believe those rules still apply today, but mostly to traditional broadcasters. So what's being proposed here isn't much different than that, especially given the reach that TikTok has. However, some creators brought up the issue that if TikTok does eventually go away, if they do not divest themselves, they've stated they don't wish to do so, what would happen to those creators who lose their jobs essentially? Do they get unemployment benefits? There was a lot of interesting discussion that came out of that. And lastly, we had some folks talking about Federal Trade Commission guidelines related to disclosing brand deals and sponsorships. You all know where I'm at on this. I believe in full disclosure all the time. However, some creators there felt it to be a burden. Some felt that it was hurting their viewership. They get less views if they disclose that it's a sponsored post. So be it. That's the way it works. But there's actually some good discussion that came out of this because there really isn't a standard for how a platform allows a creator to disclose things. So for example, I felt, although YouTube does have a button for paid sponsorships, that you should be verbally saying it as well so the viewer can hear it in case they're not watching the video, and that's actually part of the law. But maybe there needs to be something that works more consistently across platform that allows these disclosures to get made in a way that works well, especially for creators that put their content in multiple places. I know that I put content just about everywhere I can, and things work differently on Twitter, on Meta, on my blog, and on YouTube, and it would be great to have perhaps some standardization around that. You don't need a law for that. You don't need a regulation for it. But these events that get put together are a great way to get everybody in the room together to talk about something that they all may not have been thinking about before, at least in the way that a problem like this might present itself. And when you think about conferences, you know, a lot of the conferences in the industry are put together by some player in the industry, and there are sponsors to cover the cost of those conferences, and they can often put a thumb on the scale as to who's in attendance and what opinions are heard. And so sometimes having the White House, in this case, sponsor an event makes it a better way to get more ideas out in the open. And it doesn't always mean they're going to end up in some kind of restrictive law or regulation. And I think that was the value of this conference. I'm going to put some links in the video description for some write-ups about this, including this New York Times article here where I was quoted, but also some content from some of my fellow creators who were in attendance as well. It was a great day, far more than I expected. It was incredibly well put together and organized by the White House staff. It was just a real awesome effort. In fact, the CEO of VidCon was there, Jim Latterback, I guess the former CEO now, who puts conferences together for a living, and I think he was pretty impressed with how well they did getting this right. So all in, great day. It was well worth the effort. I think if you are a creator and you see one of these invitations pop up, apply. You never know. I certainly wasn't expecting to get invited, and I did. And when I showed up there, it was great to see that they were focusing a lot on smaller creators like me and even smaller channels too. So good stuff. If you get an invitation, go no matter who the president is. That'll do it for this one. Until next time, this is Lon Seidman. Thanks for watching.